Chances are you've heard about the plane with the spiral staircase in first
Pan AM, also known as Pan American World Airways, was the principal and largest international air carrier and unofficial overseas flag carrier of the United States. The carrier was founded on March 14, 1927 as Pan American Airways. Pan AM commenced operations on October 19, 1927, but unfortunately, on December 4, 1991, Pan AM ceased operations. So, what happened? Well, let's find out. Formation. Pan American Airways Incorporated was founded as a shell company on March 14, 1927 by United States Army Air Corps officers Henry Hap Arnold, Carl Spaatz, and John Jouet, out of concern for the growing influence of the German-owned Colombian air carrier SCADTA in Central America. Operating in Colombia since 1920, SCADTA lobbied hard for landing rights in the Panama Canal Zone, ostensibly to survey air routes for a connection to the United States, which the Air Corps viewed as a precursor to a possible German aerial threat to the canal. In the spring of 1927, the United States Post Office requested bids on a contract to deliver mail from Key West to Havana, Cuba, before October 19, 1927. Arnold and Spaatz drew up the prospectus for Pan American after they learned that SCADTA hired a company in Delaware to obtain airmail contracts from the U.S. government. Also competing for the contract, Juan Trippe formed the Aviation Corporation for the Americas, ACA, on June 2, 1927, with $250,000 in startup capital and the backing of powerful and politically connected financiers, including Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney and W. Averill Harriman. Their operation had the all-important landing rights for Havana, having acquired American International Airways, a small airline established in 1926 by John K. Montgomery and Richard B. Beaver as a seaplane service from Key West, Florida to Havana. A third company, Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean Airways, was established on October 11, 1927 by New York City investment banker Richard Hoyt to bid for the contract. The Postal Service awarded Pan American Airways the U.S. mail delivery contract to Cuba at the end of the bidding process, but Pan American lacked any aircraft to perform the job and did not have landing rights in Cuba. Just days before the October 19th deadline, the three companies decided to form a partnership. ACA chartered a Fairchild FC-2 floatplane from a small Dominican Republic carrier, West Indian Aerial Express, allowing Pan AM to operate the first flight to Havana on October 19, 1927. The three companies formally merged on June 23, 1928. Richard Hoyt was named as president of the new Aviation Corporation for the Americas, but Trippe and his partners held 40% of the equity and Whitney was made president. Trippe became operational head of Pan American Airways, the new company's principal operating subsidiary. The U.S. government approved the original Pan AM's mail delivery contract with the little objection out of fears that SCADTA would have no competition in bidding for routes between Latin America and the United States. The government further helped Pan AM by insulating it from its U.S. competitors, seeing the airline as the chosen instrument for U.S.-based international air routes. The airline expanded internationally, benefiting from a virtual monopoly on foreign routes. Trippe and his associates planned to extend Pan AM's network through all of Central and South America. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, Pan Am purchased a number of alien or defunct airlines in Central and South America and negotiated with postal officials to win most of the government's airmail contracts to the region. In September 1929, Tripp toured Latin America with Charles Lindbergh to negotiate landing rights in a number of countries, including Barranquilla on SCADTA's home turf on Colombia, as well as Maracaibo and Caracas in Venezuela. By the end of the year, Pan Am offered flights along the west coast of South America to Peru. Following government favors for the denial of mail contracts to their competition, a forced merger was created with New York, Rio, and Buenos Aires line, giving a seaplane route along the east coast of South America to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and westbound to Santiago, Chile. Its Brazilian subsidiary, NYRBA do Brasil, was later renamed as Pan Air do Brasil. Pan Am also partnered with the Grace Shipping Company in 1929 to form Pan American Airways, better known as Panagar, to gain a foothold to destinations in South America. In the same year, Pan Am acquired a controlling stake in Mexicana de Aviación and took over Mexicana's Ford Tri-Motor route between Brownsville, Texas and Mexico City, extending the service to the Yucatan Peninsula to connect with Pan Am's Caribbean route network. Pan Am's holding company, the Aviation Corporation of the Americas, was one of the most sought-after stocks in the New York Curb Exchange in 1929, and flurries of speculation surrounded each of its new route awards. In April 1929, Tripp and his associates reached an agreement with United States Aircraft and Transport Corporation, UATC, to segregate Pan Am operations to the south of the Mexico-United States border in exchange for UATC taking a large shareholder stake. UATC was the parent company of what are now Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, and United Airlines. The Aviation Corporation of the Americas changed its name to Pan American Airways Corporation in 1931. Clipper era. Pan Am started its South American routes with Consolidated Commodore and Sikorsky S-38 flying boats. The S-40, larger than the 8-passenger S-38, began flying for Pan Am in 1931. Carrying the nicknames American Clipper, Southern Clipper, and Caribbean Clipper, they were the first of the series of 28 Clippers that symbolized Pan Am between 1931 and 1946. During this time, Pan Am operated Clipper services to Latin America from the International Pan American Airport at Dinner Key in Miami, Florida. In 1937, Pan Am turned to Britain and France to begin seaplane service between the United States and Europe. Pan Am reached an agreement with both countries to offer service from Norfolk, Virginia to Europe via Bermuda and the Azores using the S-42s. A joint service from Port Washington, New York to Bermuda began in June 1937 with Pan Am using Sikorsky and Imperial Airways using the C-class flying boat RMA Cavalier. On July 5, 1937, survey flights across the North Atlantic began. Pan Am Clipper 3, a Sikorsky S-42, landed a boatwood in the Bay of Exploits in Newfoundland from Port Washington via Shediac, New Brunswick. The next day, Pan Am Clipper 3 left Botwood in Foynes in Ireland. The same day, a short Empire C-class flying boat, the Caledonia, left Foynes for Botwood and landed July 6, 1937, reaching Montreal on July 8th and New York on July 9th. TRIP decided to start a service from San Francisco to Honolulu and on to Hong Kong and Auckland following steamship routes. After negotiating traffic rights in 1934 to land at Pearl Harbor, Midway Island, Wake Island, Guam, and Subic Bay, Manila, Pan Am shipped $500,000 worth of aeronautical equipment westward in March 1935 using the North Haven, a 15,000-ton merchant ship chartered for the purpose of provisioning each island that the clippers would have to stop at on their 4 to 5 day flight. Pan Am ran its first survey flight to Honolulu in April 1935 with a Silkersea S-42 flying boat. The airline won the contract for a San Francisco-Canton mail route later that year and operated its first commercial flight carrying mail and express no passengers in a Martin M130 from Alameda to Manila amid media fanfare on November 22, 1935. The 5-leg, 8,000-mile, 12,875-kilometer flight arrived in Manila on November 29th and returned to San Francisco on December 6th, cutting the time between the two cities by the fastest scheduled steamship by over 2 weeks. Both the United States and Philippine Islands issued special stamps for the two flights. The first passenger flight left Alameda on October 21st, 1936. The fare from San Francisco to Manila or Hong Kong in 1937 was $950 one way, which is about $17,100 in 2020 and $1,710 round trip. TRIP and its associates plan to extend Pan Am's network through all of Central and South America. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, Pan Am purchased a number of alien or defunct airlines. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, Pan Am purchased a number of ailing or defunct airlines in Central and South America and negotiated with postal officials to win most of the government's airmail contacts in the region. In September 1929, TRIP toured Latin America with Charles Lindbergh to negotiate landing rights in a number of countries, including Barranquilla and on SCADTA's home turf of Colombia, as well as Maracaibo and Caracas in Venezuela. By the end of the year, Pan Am offered flights along the west coast of South America to Peru. Following government favors for the denial of mail contracts to their competition, a forced merger was created with New York, Rio, and Buenos Aires line, giving a seaplane route along the east coast of South America, Buenos Aires, Argentina, and westbound in Santiago, Chile. Its Brazilian subsidiary NYRBA do Brazil was later renamed as Pan Air do Brazil. Pan Am also partnered with Grace Shipping Company in 1929 to form Pan American Airways, better known as Panagaria, to gain a foothold to destinations in South America. In the same year, Pan Am acquired a controlling stake in Mexicana de Aviación and took over Mexicana's Ford Tri-Motor route between Brownsville, Texas, and Mexico City, extending this service to Yucatan Peninsula to connect with Pan Am's Caribbean route network. On August 6, 1937, Juan Tripp accepted United States Aviation's highest annual prize, the Collier Trophy, on behalf of PAA from President Franklin D. Roosevelt for the company's establishment of the Trans-Pacific Airline and the successful execution of extended overwater navigation and the regular operations thereof. Pan Am also used Boeing 314 flying boats for the Pacific route. In China, passengers could connect to domestic flights on the Pan Am-operated China National Aviation Corporation CNAC network co-owned with the Chinese government. Pan Am flew to Singapore for the first time in 1941, starting a semi-monthly service which reduced San Francisco-Singapore travel times from 25 days to 6 days. 6 large, long-range Boeing 314 flying boats were delivered to Pan Am in early 1939. On March 30th, 1939, the Yankee Clipper, piloted by Harold E. Gray, made the first ever transatlantic passenger flight. The first leg of the flight, Baltimore to Horta, took 17 hours and 32 minutes and covered 2,400 miles. The second leg from Horta to Pan Am's newly built airport in Lisbon took 7 hours and 7 minutes and covered 1,200 miles. The Boeing 314 also enabled the start of scheduled weekly contract for an airmail FAM-18 service and later passenger flights from New York, Port Washington, LI to both France and Britain. The southern route to France was inaugurated for airmail on May 20th, 1939 by the Yankee Clipper piloted by Arthur E. Laporte, flying via Porto Arezoes and Lisbon, Portugal to Merel. Passenger service over the route was added on June 28, 1939 by Dixie Clipper piloted by R.O.D. Suvillian. The eastbound trip departed every Wednesday at noon and arrived at Marseilles on Friday at 3 p.m. GCT, with the return service leaving Marseilles on Sunday at 8 a.m. and arriving at Port Washington on Tuesday at 7 a.m. The northern transatlantic route to Britain was inaugurated for airmail service on June 24, 1939 by the Yankee Clipper piloted by Harold Gray, flying via Shediac, New Brunswick, Botwood, Newfoundland, and Vorennes, Ireland to Southampton. Passenger service was added on the northern route on July 8, 1939 by the Yankee Clipper. Eastbound flights left on Saturday at 7:30 a.m. and arrived at Southampton on Sunday at 1 p.m. GCT. Westbound service departed at Southampton on Wednesday at noon and arrived at Port Washington on Tuesday at 3 p.m. After the outbreak of World War II in Europe on September 1st, 1939, the terminus became Vorennes until the service ceased for the winter on October 5th, while transatlantic service to Lisbon via the Arezoes continued into 1941. During World War II, Pan Am flew over 90 million miles, 145 million kilometers worldwide in support of military operations. The Clippers, the name harkened back to the 19th century. Fast-sailing Clippers were the only American passenger aircraft of the time capable of intercontinental travel. To compete with ocean liners, the airline offered first-class seats on such flights, and the style of flight crews became more formal. Instead of being leather-jacketed, silk-scarfed airmail pilots, the crews of the Clippers wore naval-style uniforms and adopted a set procession when boarding the aircraft. In 1940, Pan Am and TWA both received and began using Boeing 307 Stratoliner, the first pressurized airliner in the service and the first with a flight engineer in the crew. The Boeing 307's airline service was short-lived as all were accommodated for military service and when the United States entered World War II. During World War II, most Clippers were pressed into military service. A new Pan Am subsidiary pioneered a new air military supply route across the Atlantic from Brazil to West Africa. The onward flight to Sudan and Egypt tracked an existing British civil air route. In January 1942, the Pacific Clipper completed the first circumnavigation of the globe by a commercial airliner. Another first occurred in January 1943 when Franklin D. Roosevelt became the first U.S. president to fly aboard in the Dixie Clipper. During this period, Star Trek curator Gene Roddenberry was a Clipper pilot. He was aboard the Clipper Eclipse when it crashed in Syria on June 19, 1947. While waiting at Foynes, County Limerick, Ireland for a Pan Am Clipper flight to New York in 1942, passengers were served a drink today known as Irish coffee by Chief Joe Sheridan. Post-war expansion and modernization. The growing importance of air transport in the post-war era meant that Pan Am would no longer enjoy the official patronage it had been offered in pre-war days to prevent the emergence of any meaningful competition but at home and aboard. Although Pan Am continued to use its political influence to lobby for protection of its position as America's primary international airline, it encountered increasing competition from the American export airlines across the Atlantic to Europe and subsequently from others including TWA to Europe, Braniff to South America, United to Hawaii, and Northwest Orient to East Asia, as well as 5 potential rivals to Mexico. This changed situation resulted from the new post-war approach the Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, took toward the promotion of competition between major U.S. carriers on key domestic and international scheduled routes compared with pre-war U.S. aviation policy. AOA was the first airline to begin regular land plane flights across the Atlantic on October 24, 1945. In January 1946, Pan Am scheduled 7 DC-4s a week east from LaGuardia Airport, 5 to London Hearn Airport, and 2 to Lisbon. Time to Hearn was 17 hours and 40 minutes, including stops, or 20 hours 45 minutes to Lisbon. A Boeing 314 flying boat flew LaGuardia to Lisbon once every 2 weeks in 29 hours and 30 minutes. Flying boat flights ended shortly thereafter. TWA's transatlantic challenged the impending introduction of its faster pressurized Lockheed Constellations resulted in Pan Am ordering its own Constellation fleet at $750,000 apiece. Pan Am began transatlantic Constellation flights on January 14, 1946, beating TWA by 3 weeks. In January 1946, a flight from Miami to Buenos Aires took 71 hours and 15 minutes in Pan Am DC-3, but the following summer DC-4s flew Idlewild to Buenos Aires in 38 hours and 30 minutes. In January 1958, Pan Am's DC-7Bs flew New York to Buenos Aires in 25 hours, 20 minutes, while the national Pan Am Panagera DC-7B via Panama and Lima took 22 hours, 45 minutes. Convair 240s replaced DC-3s and other pre-war types on Pan Am's shorter flights in the Caribbean and South America. Pan Am also acquired a few Certus C-46 for a freight network that eventually extended to Buenos Aires. In January 1946, Pan Am had no trans-Pacific flights beyond Hawaii, but they soon resumed with DC-4s. In January 1958, the California to Tokyo flight was a daily Stratocruiser that took 31 hours, 45 minutes from San Francisco, or 32 hours, 15 minutes from Los Angeles. A flight to Seattle and connection to Northwest's DC-7C totaled 24 hours, 13 minutes from San Francisco, but Pan Am was not allowed to fly that route. The Stratocruiser's double-deck full stage was with sleep-in berths, and lower-deck lounge helped it compete with its rival. Super Stratocruisers with more fuel appeared on Pan Am's transatlantic routes in November 1954, making non-stop eastward and one-stop westward schedules more reliable. In June 1947, Pan Am started the first scheduled round-the-world airline flight. In September, the weekly DC-4 was scheduled to leave San Francisco at 22:00 Thursday as Flight 1, stopping at Honolulu, Midway, Wake, Guam, Manila, Bangkok, and arriving in Calcutta on Monday at 12:45, where it met Flight 2, a Constellation that had left New York at 23:30 Friday. The DC-4 returned to San Francisco as Flight 2. The Constellation left Calcutta 13:30 Tuesday, stopped at Karachi, Istanbul, London, Shannon, Gardiner, and arrived at LaGuardia Thursday at 14:55. A few months later, PA-3 took over the Manila route, while PA-1 shifted to Tokyo and Shanghai. All Pan Am round-the-world flights included at least one change of plane until Boeing 707s took over in 1960. PA-1 became daily in 1962 and 63, making different en-route stops on different days of the week. In January 1963, it left San Francisco at 0900 daily and was scheduled into New York 56 hours, 10 minutes later. Los Angeles replaced San Francisco in 1968. While Boeing 747s finished replacing 707s in 1971, all stops except Tehran and Karachi were served daily in each direction. For a year or so, in 1975 to 76, Pan Am finally completed the round-world trip New York to New York. In January 1950, Pan American Airways Corporation officially became Pan American World Airways Incorporated. The airline had begun calling itself Pan American World Airways in 1943. In September 1950, Pan Am completed the $17.45 million purchase of American Overseas Airline from American Airlines. That month, Pan Am ordered 45 Douglas DC-6Bs. The first Clipper Liberty Bell N6518C inaugurated Pan Am's all-tourist class rainbow service between New York and London on May 1st, 1952 to complete the all-first President Stratocruiser service. From June 1954, DC-6Bs began replacing DC-4s on Pan Am's internal German routes. Pan Am introduced the Douglas DC-7Cs on transatlantic routes in summer 1956. In January 1958, the DC-7C nonstop took 10 hours, 45 minutes idle while to London, enabling Pan Am to hold its own against TWA's Super Constellations and Starliners. In 1957, Pan Am started DC-7C flights direct from the west coast of the United States to London and Paris with a fuel stop in Canada or Greenland. The introduction of the faster Bristol Britannia turboprop by British Overseas Airways Corporation BOAC between New York and London from December 19, 1957 ended Pan Am's competitive leadership there. In January 1958, Pan Am scheduled 47 flights a week east from Idlewild to Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The following August, there were 65. Jet age. Although Pan Am contemplated purchasing the United Kingdom's de Havilland Comets, having been the first jetliner in the world, they ultimately waited for Boeing to release their first jetliner, and thus was the launch customer of the Boeing 707, placing an order for 20 in October 1995. It also ordered 25 of Douglas's DC-8, which could seat 6 across. The 707 originally was to be the 144 inches, 3.66 meters wide, with 5 abreast seating. Boeing widened it to match the DC-8. The combined order value was $269 million. Pan Am's first scheduled jet flight was from New York Idlewood to Paris Le Bourget, stopping at Gander to refuel on October 26, 1958 with Boeing 707-122 Clipper America N711PA with 111 passengers. The 320 Intercontinental Series 707 in 1959-60 and the Douglas DC-8 in March 1960 enabled non-stop transatlantic crossings with a viable payload in both directions. Wide-body era. Pan Am was the launch customer of the Boeing 747, placing a $525 million order for 25 in April 1966. On January 15, 1970, First Lady Pat Nixon christened a Pan Am Boeing 747 Clipper Young America at Washington Dulles in the presence of Pan Am President Najib Halabi. During the next few days, Pan Am flew several 747s to major airports in the United States as a public relations effort, allowing the public to tour the airplanes. Pan Am began its final preparations for the first 747 service on the evening of January 21st, 1970, when Clipper Young America was scheduled to fly from New York John F. Kennedy to London Heathrow. An engine failure delayed the inaugural flight's departure by several hours, necessitating the substitution of another 747 Clipper Victor, which eventually flew to London Heathrow. Passengers cheered and drank champagne as the jet finally lifted off from the runway at John F. Kennedy Airport. Pan Am carried 11 million passengers over 20 billion miles, 32 billion kilometers in 1970, the year it revolutionized air travel with the first wide-bodied airliner. Supersonic plans. Pan Am was one of the first 3 airliners to sign options for the Aeropostale BAC Concorde, but the other airliners took that out options, with the exception of BOAC and Air France. It did not purchase the supersonic jet. Pan Am was the first U.S. airline to sign for the Boeing 2707, the American Supersonic Transport SST project, with 15 delivery positions reserved. These aircraft never saw service after Congress voted against additional funding in 1971. Computerized reservations, Pan Am building, and world port. Pan Am commissioned IBM to build Panamac, a large computer that booked airline and hotel reservations, which was installed in 1964. It also held large amounts of information about cities, countries, airports, aircraft, hotels, and restaurants. The computer occupied the 4th floor of the Pan Am building, which was the largest commercial office building in the world for some time. The airline also built Worldport, a terminal building at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. It was distinguished by its elliptical 4-acre, 16,000-meter squared roof, suspended far from the outside columns of the terminal below by 32 sets of steel posts and cables. The terminal was designed to allow passengers to board and disembark via stairs without getting wet by parking the nose of the aircraft under the overhang. The introduction of the jet bridge made this feature obsolete. Pan Am built a gilded training building in the style of Edward Durrell Stone, designed by Stewart Skinner, architects in Miami. Peak. At its peak in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Pan Am advertised under the slogan, "the world's most experienced airline." It carried 6.7 million passengers in 1966, and by 1968, its 150 jets flew to 86 countries on every continent except for Antarctica over a scheduled route network of 81,410 unduplicated miles, which is 131,000 kilometers. During that period, the airline was profitable, and its cash reserves totaled $1 billion. Most routes were between New York, Europe, and South America, and between Miami and the Caribbean. In 1964, Pan Am began helicopter shuttle between New York's John F. Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark airports, and Lower Manhattan, operated by New York Airways. Aside from the DC-8, the Boeing 707 and 747, the Pan Am jet fleet included Boeing 720Bs and 727s, the first aircraft to sport Pan Am, rather than Pan American titles. The airline later had Boeing 737s and 747 SPs, which could fly non-stop New York to Tokyo, Lockheed L1011, TriStars, McDonnell Douglas DC-10s, and Airbus A300s and A310s. Pan Am owned the Intercontinental Hotel chain and had a financial interest in the Falcon Jet Corporation, which held marketing rights to the Dassault Falcon 20 business jet in North America. The airline was involved in curating a missile tracking range in South Atlantic and operating nuclear engine testing laboratory in Nevada. In addition, Pan Am participated in several notable humanitarian flights. At its height, Pan Am was well regarded for its modern fleet and experienced crews. Cabin staff were multilingual and usually college graduates hired from around the world, frequently with nursing training. Pan Am's onboard service and cuisine, inspired by Maxims de Paris, were delivered with a personal flair that has already been equaled. Internal German services, IGS, and other operations. From 1950 until 1990, Pan Am operated a comprehensive network of high-frequency, short-haul scheduled services between West Germany and West Berlin, first with Douglas DC-4s, then with DC-6Bs from 1954, and Boeing 727s from 1966. This had to come about as a result of an agreement among the United States and the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, which prohibited Germany from having any of its own airlines and restricted the provision of commercial air services from and to Berlin to air transport providers headquartered in these four countries. Rising Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the three Western powers resulted in unilateral Soviet withdrawal from the Quadruplet Allied Control Commission in 1948, culminating in the division of Germany the following year. These events, together with Soviet insistence on a very narrow interpretation of the post-war agreement on the Western powers' access rights to Berlin, meant that until the end of the Cold War, air transport in West Berlin continued to be confined to the carriers of the remaining Allied Control Commission powers, with aircraft required to fly across hostile East German territory through three 20 miles, 32 kilometers wide air corridors at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters. The airline's West Berlin operation consistently accounted for more than half of the city's entire commercial air traffic during that period. For years, more passengers boarded Pan Am flights at Berlin Tempelhof than at any other airport. Pan Am operated a Berlin crew base of mainly German flight attendants and American pilots to staff its IGS flights. The German national flight attendants were later taken over by Lufthansa when it acquired Pan Am's Berlin route authorities. Over the years, other local flight attendant bases outside the US included London for intra-Europe and transatlantic, flying Warsaw, Istanbul, and Belgrade for intra-Europe flights. Tel Aviv base solely staffing the daily Tel Aviv-Paris-Tel Aviv service, a Narraburi base solely staffing the Narraburi-Frankfurt-Narraburi service, as well as Delhi and Bombay bases for India-Frankfurt flights. Pan Am also operated rest and recreation R&R flights during the Vietnam War. These flights carried American service personnel for R&R leaves in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and other Asian cities. Passenger traffic from 1951 to 1989. Revenue passenger miles, million. Scheduled flights only. 1951, Pan American 1,551, National Airlines 432, 1955, 2,676 for Pan American, National Airline 905, 1960, Pan American 4,833, National Airlines 1,041, 1965, 8,869, Pan American, National Airlines 2,663, 1970, Pan American 16,389, National Airlines 2,643, 1975, Pan American 14,863, National Airlines, 3,865, 1979, 22,872 for Pan American, 8,294 for National Airlines. National Airlines merged with Pan American in 1980. 1981, 28,924. 1985, 27,144. 1989, 29,359. In August 1953, PAA scheduled passenger flights to 106 airports. In May 1968, 122 airports. In November 1978, to 65 airports, plus a few freight-only airports. In November 1985, 98 airports. In November 1991, to 46 airports, plus 14 more with only Pan Am Express prop flights. Downturn fallout from 1973 oil crisis. Pan Am had invested in a large fleet of Boeing 747s, expecting that air travel would continue to increase. It did not, as the introduction of many wide bodies by Pan Am, its competitors coincided with an economic slowdown. Reduced air travel after the 1973 oil crisis made the overcapacity problem worse. Pan Am was vulnerable with its high overheads as a result of a large, decentralized infrastructure. High fuel prices and its many older, less fuel-efficient narrow-bodied airplanes increased the airline's operating costs. Federal route awards to other airlines, such as the Trans-Pacific route case, further reduced the number of passenger Pan Am carried and its profit margins. On September 23, 1974, a group of Pan Am employees published an advertisement in the New York Times to register their disagreement over federal policies which they felt were harming the financial viability of their employer. The ad cited discrepancies in airport landing fees, such as Pan Am paying $4,200 to land a plane in Sydney, while the Australian carrier Qantas paid only $178 to land a jet in Los Angeles. The ad also contended that the United States Postal Service was paying foreign airlines 5 times as much as to carry U.S. mail in comparison to Pan Am. Finally, the ad questioned why the Export-Import Bank of the United States loaned money to Japan, France, and Saudi Arabia at 6% interest while Pan Am paid 12%. By the mid-1970s, Pan Am had racked up $364 million of accumulated losses over a 10-year period, and its debts approached $1 billion. This threatened the airline with bankruptcy. Former American Airlines Vice President of Operations William T. Sewell, who had released Najib Halabi as Pan Am president in 1972, began implementing a turnaround strategy, trimming the network 25%, slashing the 40,000-strong workforce by 30%, and cutting wages, introducing stringent economies and rescheduling debt, and reducing the size of the fleet. These measures, aided by the use of tax loss credits, enabled Pan Am to avert financial collapse and return to profitability in 1977. Attempts to build a U.S. domestic network. Since the 1930s, Juan Trippe had coveted domestic routes for Pan Am. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s and the mid-1970s, there were talks of merging the airline with a domestic operator such as American Airlines, Eastern Airlines, Trans World Airlines, or United Airlines. As rival airlines convinced Congress that Pan Am would use its political clout to monopolize U.S. air routes, the CAB repeatedly denied the airline permission to operate in the U.S. by growth or a merger with another airline. Pan Am remained an American carrier operating international routes only aside from Hawaii and Alaska. The last time Pan Am was permitted to merge with another airline prior to the deregulation of the U.S. airline industry was in 1950 when it took over American Overseas Airlines from American Airlines. After deregulation in 1978, more U.S. domestic airlines began competing with Pan Am internationally. National Airlines takeover. To acquire domestic routes, Pan Am under President Sewell set its eyes on National Airlines. Pan Am wound up a bidding war with Frank Lorenzo's Texas International that boosted National stock price, but Pan Am was granted permission to buy National in 1980, and that was described as the coup of the decade. The acquisition of National Airlines for $437 million further burdened Pan Am's balance sheet, already under strain after financing the Boeing 747s ordered in the mid-1960s. The acquisition did little to improve Pan Am's competitive position in relation to Nibbler, lower-cost competitors in a deregulated industry, as National's north-south route structure provided insufficient feed at Pan Am's transatlantic and trans-Pacific gateways in New York and Los Angeles. The airlines had incompatible fleets apart from the Boeing 727 and corporate cultures, partly as a result of National being perceived by some Pan Am employees as mainly as regional backwoods carrier with few trunk routes, and the integration was poorly handled by Pan Am management, who proceeded over an increase in labor costs as a result of harmonizing National's pay scales with Pan Am's. Although revenues increased by 62% from 179 to 1980, fuel costs from the merger increased by 157% during a weak economic climate. Further, miscellaneous expenses increased by 74%. Disposal of non-core assets and operational cutbacks. As 1980 progressed, the airline's financial situation worsened. Sewell began selling Pan Am's non-core assets. The first asset to be sold off was the airline's 50% interest in Falcon Jet Corporation in August. Later in November, Pan Am sold the Pan Am building to Metropolitan Life Insurance Company for $400 million. In September 1981, Pan Am sold off its Intercontinental Hotels chain. Before this transaction closed, Sewell was replaced by C. Edward Acker, Air Florida's founder and ex-president, as well as former Braniff International executive. The combined sale value of Intercontinental chain and the Falcon Jet Corp stake was $500 million. Acker followed up the asset disposal program he had inherited from his predecessor with operational cutbacks. Most prominent among these was the discontinuation of the round-the-world service from October 31st, 1982, when Pan Am ceased flying between Delhi, Bangkok, and Hong Kong due to the sector's unprofitability. To provide additional seating capacity for its 1983 spring/summer season, the airline also acquired 3 passenger Boeing 747-200Bs and from Flying Tigers, who took 4 Pan Am 747-100 freighters in return. Fleet restructuring. Despite Pan Am's precarious financial situation, in summer 1984, Acker went ahead with an order for new Airbus models in wide-body and narrow-bodied aircraft, becoming the second American company to order Airbus aircraft after Eastern Airlines. These advanced aircraft, economically and operationally superior to the 747s and 727s Pan Am operated at the same time, were intended to make the airline more competitive. In 1985, new A310-221s began replacing 727s on the internal German services. IGS and A300s flew in the Caribbean networks later the same year, while from early 1986 additional new longer range A310-222s replaced some of the 747s on the same slimmed down transatlantic network following ETOP's certification approval by the Federal Aviation Administration FAA of transoceanic flying with a twin-engined aircraft. The first A310 ETOPS transatlantic route was the New York to Hamburg, Detroit to London, followed shortly after that. Pan Am's decision to not take delivery of the A320s and to sell its delivery positions to Braniff meant that the majority of its short-haul U.S. domestic and European feeder routes and most of its IGS services continued to be flown with obsolete 727s until the airline's demise. This put it at a disadvantage against rivals operating state-of-the-art aircraft with greater passenger appeal. In September 1984, Pan American Airways created a holding company called Pan Am Corporation to assume ownership and control of the airline and the services division. Sale of Pacific Division. Given the airline's dire state, in April 1985, Acker sold Pan Am's entire Pacific Division, which consisted of 25% of its entire route system and their majority hub at Tokyo Narita International Airport, to United Airlines address. Fleet incompatibility issues related to the earlier acquisitions of national airlines, as it included Pan Am's Pratt & Whitney JT9D powered 747 SPs, its Rolls-Royce RB211 powered L1011 500s, and the General Electric CF6 powered DC-10s inherited from National, which were transferred to United along with the Pacific routes. Establishment of local feeder networks. In the early 1980s, Pan Am contracted several regional airlines: Air Atlanta, Emerald Air, Empire Airlines, Presidential Airways, and Republic Airlines to operate feeder flights under the Pan Am Express branding. The acquisition of Pennsylvania-based commuter airline Ransom Airlines for $65 million, which was finalized in 1987, was meant to address the issue of providing additional feed for Pan Am's mainline services at its hubs in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami in the United States, and Berlin in Germany. The renamed Pan Am Express operated routes mostly from New York, as well as Berlin, Germany. Miami services were added in 1990. However, the regional Pan Am Express operation provided only an incremental feed to Pan Am's international route system, which was now focused on the Atlantic Division, U.S. East Coast Shuttle. In an attempt to gain presence on the busy Washington, New York, Boston commuter air corridor, the Ransom acquisition was accompanied by the $100 million purchase of New York Air's shuttle service between Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. This parallel move was intended to enable Pan Am to provide a high-frequency service for high-yield business travelers in direct competition with the long-established successful Eastern Airlines shuttle operation. The renamed Pan Am shuttle began operating out of LaGuardia Airport's refurbished historic Marine Air Terminal in October 1986. However, it did not address the pressing issue of Pan Am's continuing lack of a strong domestic feeder network, financial, operational, and reputational setbacks. In 1987, Towers Financial Corporation, led by its CEO Stephen Hoffenberg and his consultant Jeffrey Epstein, unsuccessfully tried to take over Pan Am in a corporate raid with Towers Financial as their raiding vessel. The bid failed. Thomas G. Plaskett, a former American Airlines and Continental executive, replaced Acker as president in January 1988, joining Pan Am from the latter. While a program to refurbish Pan Am aircraft and improve the company's on-time performance began showing positive results, in fact, Pan Am's most profitable quarter ever was the third quarter of While a program to refurbish Pan Am aircraft and improve the company's on-time performance began showing positive results, in fact, Pan Am's most profitable quarter ever was a third of the quarter of 1988. On December 21st, 1988, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 above Lochaber, Scotland, resulted in 270 fatalities. Faced with a $300 million lawsuit filed by more than 100 families of the victims, the airline subpoenaed records of 6 U.S. government agencies, including the CIA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the State Department. Though the records suggested that the U.S. government was aware of the warnings of a bombing and failed to pass the information to the airline, the families claimed Pan Am was attempting to shift the blame. Also, in December 1988, FAA fined Pan Am for 19 security failures out of the 236 that were detected among its 29 airlines. Failed bid for Northwest Airlines. In June 1989, Plaskett presented Northwest Airlines with a $2.7 billion takeover bid that was backed by Bankers Trust, Morgan Guaranty, Trust Citicorp, and Prudential Bank. The proposed merger was Pan Am's final attempt to create a strong domestic network to provide sufficient feed for the 2 remaining mainline hubs at New York, JFK, and Miami. It was also intended to help the airline regain its status as a global airline by re-establishing a sizable trans-Pacific presence. The merger was expected to result in annual savings of $240 million. However, billionaire financier Al Chichi outbid Pan Am by presenting Northwest's directors with a superior proposal. Fallout from 1990-91 Persian Gulf War. The first Gulf War, triggered by the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, caused fuel prices to rise, which severely depressed the global economic activity. This in turn caused a sharp contraction of worldwide air travel demand, plunging once profitable operations, including Pan Am's prime transatlantic routes, into steep losses. These unforeseen events constituted a further major blow to Pan Am, which was still reeling from the 1988 Lockerbie disaster. To shore up its finances, Pan Am sold most of its routes serving London Heathrow, arguably Pan Am's most important international destination, to United Airlines. This left Pan Am with only 2 daily London flights, serving Detroit and Miami, which used Gatwick as their London terminal from the start of the 1990-91 winter timetable. Further asset disposals included Pan Am's sale of its IGS routes to Berlin to Lufthansa for $150 million, which became effective at the time and brought the total value of asset disposals to $1.2 billion. These measures were accompanied by the elimination of 2,500 jobs, 8.6% of its workforce. These cutbacks were announced by the airline in September 1990. Bankruptcy. Pan Am was forced to file for bankruptcy protection in January 8, 1991. Delta Airlines purchased the remaining profitable assets of Pan Am, including its remaining European routes, except one from Miami to Paris, and Frankfurt Mini-Hub, the shuttle operation, 45 jets, and the Pan Am Worldport at John F. Kennedy Airport for $416 million. Delta also injected $100 million, becoming a 45% owner of a reorganized but smaller Pan Am serving the Caribbean, Central, and South America from a main hub in Miami. The airline's creditors would hold the other 55%. The Boston, New York LaGuardia, Washington National Pan Am shuttle service was taken over by Delta in September 1991. 2 months later, Delta assumed all of Pan Am's remaining transatlantic traffic rights except Miami to Paris and London. In October 1991, former Douglas Aircraft executive Russell Ray Jr. was hired as Pan Am's new president and CEO. As part of this restructuring, Pan Am relocated its headquarters from the Pan Am building in New York City to new offices in the Miami area in preparation for the airline's relaunch of both Miami and New York on November 1st. The new airline would have operated approximately 60 aircraft and generated about $1.2 billion in annual revenues with 7,500 employees. Following the relaunch, Pan Am continued to sustain heavy losses. Revenue throughout October and November 1991 fell short of what had been anticipated in the reorganization plan, with Delta claiming that Pan Am was losing $3 million a day. This undermined Delta's Wall Street's and the traveling public's confidence in the viability of the reorganized Pan Am. Pan Am's senior executives outlined a projected shortfall of between $100 million and possibly $200 million, with the airline requiring a $25 million installment just to fly through the following week. On the evening of December 3rd, Pan Am's creditors committee advised U.S. bankruptcy judge Cornelius Blackshear that it was close to convincing an airline, TWA, to invest $15 million to keep Pan Am operating. A deal with TWA owner Carl Icahn could not be struck. Pan Am opened for business at 9 a.m. and within the hour, Ray was forced to withdraw Pan Am's plan of reorganization and executive and immediate shutdown plan for Pan Am. Pan Am ceased operations on December 4th, 1991, following a decision by Delta CEO Ron Allen and other senior executives not to go ahead with the final $25 million payment Pan Am was scheduled to receive the weekend after Thanksgiving. As a result, some 7,500 Pan Am employees lost their jobs, thousands of whom had worked in the New York City area and were preparing to move to the Miami area to work at Pan Am's new headquarters near Miami International Airport. Economists predicted that 9,000 jobs in the Miami area, including jobs at companies not connected to Pan Am that were dependent on the airline's presence, would be lost after it folded. The carrier's last flown scheduled operation was Pan Am Flight 436, which departed that day from Bridgetown, Barbados at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miami under the command of Captain Mark Pyle, filing Clipper Goodwill, a Boeing 727-200 N368PA. Delta was sued for more than $2.5 billion on December 9, 1991 by the Pan Am Creditors Committee. Shortly thereafter, a large group of former Pan Am employees sued Delta. In December 1994, a federal judge ruled in favor of Delta, concluding that it was not liable for Pan Am's demise. Pan Am was the third American major airline to shut down in 1991 after Eastern Airlines and Midway Airlines. After serving only 2 months as Pan Am CEO, Ray was replaced by Peter McHugh to supervise the sale of Pan Am's remaining assets by Pan Am's Creditors Committee. Pan Am's last remaining hub at Miami International Airport was split during the following years between United Airlines and American Airlines. TWA's Carl Icahn purchased Pan Am Express at a court-ordered bankruptcy auction for $13 million, renaming it Trans World Express. The Pan Am brand was sold to Charles Cobb, CEO of Cobb Partners and former United States Ambassador of the Republic of Iceland under President George H.W. Bush, and Under Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce and under President Reagan. Cobb, along with Hannah Frost Partners, invested in a new Pan American Airways, headed by veteran airline executive Martin R. Shrug Jr., a former Pan Am executive with 20 years of experience at the original carrier. In his book, Pan Am, an aviation legend, Barnaby Conrad III contends that the collapse of the original Pan Am was a combination of corporate mismanagement, government indifference to protecting its prime international carrier, and flawed regulatory policy. He cites an observation made by former Pan Am Vice President for External Affairs Stanley Wirtz. What could go wrong did. No one followed Juan Trippe had the foresight to do something strongly positive. It was the most astonishing example of Murphy's Law in extremis. The sale of Pan Am's profitable parts was inevitable to the company's destruction. There were not enough pieces to build on. Stanley Gwertz. Under the terms of bankruptcy, the airline's International Flight Academy in Miami were permitted to remain open. It was established as an independent training organization beginning in 1992 under its current name, Pan Am International Flight Academy. The company began operating by using the flight simulation and type rating training center of the defunct Pan Am. In 2006, American Capital Strategies invested $58 million into the academy. Owned by the parent of Japanese airline All Nippon Airways, as of October 2014, Pan Am International Flight Academy is always surviving division of Pan American World Airways. And there's the history of Pan Am. So, what went wrong? Well, if you read the book, Pan Am, an aviation legend, Barnaby Conrad III, it basically explains everything that went wrong. It has to do stuff with corporate mismanagement, government indifference, to protecting its prime into protecting its time with international, into like basically protecting its prime as an international carrier. And it also had a flawed regulatory policy. Anyways, this is where I'm going to end off this video. If you guys haven't enjoyed this video, please make sure to hit that like button, and also don't forget to subscribe because I do videos every single day. And also don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a single video that I upload. And also don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell on my second channel. My second channel will be the third link in the description below. And if you guys would like to send me fan art, you guys can send me fan art on my Instagram. My Instagram will be the second link in the description below. And if you guys would like to join my Roblox fan group, my Roblox fan group will be the first link in the description below. And if you guys would like to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter will be the fourth link in the description below. And if you guys would like to follow me on Reddit, my Reddit will be the fifth link in the description below. And if you guys would like to follow me on TikTok, my TikTok will be the sixth link in the description below. And if you guys would like to check out my Facebook page will be the seventh link in the description below. And until then, I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye!